And hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm Elliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. We have local historian and teacher Robert Thompson with us here today to talk to us about his latest book, Uphill Both Ways, A History of Wayne County Schools. And Robert Thompson is a social studies teacher at Wayne High School. He's from East Lynn originally and currently lives in Wayne. He's a graduate of Wayne High School and a graduate of Marshall University with a degree in social studies education. He's the author of 13 books on local history. One of his most known and best-selling books was East Lynn Booming, and his most recent book, prior to the one we're going to talk about today, was The 12th Pole Terror, The Legend of Rebel Bill Smith. And he's written a lot about those issues and those books and those people, but also has done a lot of work on Civil War biographies of leaders and generals and people involved in the Civil War that came through and were involved in Wayne County. So we're delighted to have Robert Thompson with us today to talk to us about his great new book, Uphill Both Ways. So Robert, welcome to Chapters. Good to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So tell me a little bit about how and why you got interested in writing a book about the history of Wayne County schools.
Well, my family has always been involved in the school system. I've had multiple ancestors. My great-grandmother was a principal. She was a teacher in a one-room school. My sister is a teacher as well. I've been teaching now for 7 years in Wayne County, and it's something that my family's always been involved in, so I found it interesting, and I wanted to explore it a little bit more in depth.
So when you sat down to chart this book out or to think about putting this book together, where did you go first? Where were some of the places that you had to go to start getting information for this book? And did you have an idea in mind in terms of where you wanted to start it and how you wanted it to end?
Essentially, the one place that I wanted to go first was the one-room schools. And the reason I wanted to focus on that especially is because there were so many people still around who taught in one-room schools in Wayne County, who attended one-room schools, and these were in existence up to the 1960s. So a wealth of information, of personal histories involving those small schools throughout the county, all parts of the county. So that was one of the first routes that I looked at when I began researching for the book.
One of the things we see in your book that I think is so unique is a variety of different photographs. And you have photographs of different schools that were at one time a part of Wayne County. For example, on page 245, you have a picture of the Shiloh School in Pritchard around the year 1900 or so. Where did you go to get these pictures, and how did you determine which ones you wanted to include in the book?
Well, for many schools, there weren't very many a variety of photographs available. So for a lot of the smaller schools, especially in more rural areas, there may only be one photograph to pick from. So I didn't have a whole lot of options, but I did want to include as many pictures of as many different schools as possible, so that hopefully anyone who attended those schools would have at least one photograph in the book to kind of connect to when they read it.
Very good. I know that you've done a lot of writing, as we mentioned, about local history in Wayne County. You did a supplement series for the Wayne County News back on February 27th of 2013, and you talk about the first people in that piece to call Wayne County home were Paleo-Indians, and they kind of migrated into the area thousands of years ago. And what they did during that time was left behind tools and a lot of different things. At what point, when those first settlers come to the educational process in Wayne County, how long did it take for what we know is formalized school and formalized education to take place from the time those settlers founded Wayne County up until the period you start the book?
Okay. Well, the first European settlers, we don't know a whole lot about the Native Americans who lived in this area. That's actually going to be my next project, is researching the natives in Wayne County and the surrounding area. But the first Europeans came in about 1797, and it took roughly 8 years before the first schools were implemented, mainly because there weren't enough families or children to warrant building a school. So by the time you got to the early 1800s, you started to have the first buildings go up. The first schools were held, and most of those were taught by one or two teachers who would essentially travel a circuit, like a circuit riding minister, and they would travel throughout the county teaching at these different schools. And that same process was really in effect for basically a half century until the Civil War began. Of course, it grew, and as the population grew, there were more buildings constructed, and it became more permanent. But it was very similar throughout the first half of the 19th century.
And one of the things, too, that we learn as we read your book is that the early teachers really had dual roles. I mean, we think of teachers as having primarily one occupation, but you write about how the earliest teachers, they were farmers in addition to educators. Can you tell us a little bit about how that would work in terms of the family structure if you had a parent or someone in your household that farmed as well as taught?
Well, most of the early teachers, like you said, were primarily farmers. I mean, that was the way they fed their families. And they came in, of course, the first teacher that we know of, that he's recognized as the first teacher in Wayne County, was Thomas Napper. And he arrived in Wayne County in the early 1800s. And he was a farmer primarily, but he was educated. He knew how to read and how to write. And a few other people, like John Osborne was another example. These people that had those additional skills, they were smart. They were intelligent. They knew that if they had a skill that they could help supplement their income and help provide for their families, that they may as well take advantage of it. And whether that was a certain farming technique or some kind of business knowledge. And in these men, the case of these men, it was reading and writing. So they put that skill to work and passed on that knowledge as teachers to other people in the community.
One of the things I found interesting about Thomas Napper, we learned about him early on in your book, is that, as you mentioned, he arrived in the area in the early 1800s, but he was known for his strict style, was very strict, and dressed in pioneer attire. The dressing in pioneer attire, was that something that was a part of his style in order to gain respect in the classroom, or why was the pioneer attire? I found that so interesting that he would wear that in the classroom.
That was something that stood out to the students that he had. And in the case of Thomas Napper, he's actually one of my ancestors. Okay. And I'm descended from him, as most Nappers in this area are. And I'd always heard, since I started doing family research and started researching this area, that he was the first teacher, but I'd never really come across any accounts of his actual teaching style. So that was one thing that I found exceptionally interesting when I began researching this book, were personal accounts from students who had gone to school under him, and that was one thing that stood out. So I don't know that it was a conscious decision on his part to dress like that, or I imagine it was probably just the style of dress that he was accustomed to, and for whatever reason that stood out in the minds of some of his students.
When I was reading your book, something else that caught my attention is how schools are funded today versus how they were funded back in the 1840s. Today, we pay property taxes and levies and other things to fund schools, but back in the 1840s is very different. Parents actually had to pay out of pocket for teachers to educate their children. And you write about what happened to the poor children who couldn't afford it and where they got their funding from. Tell us a little bit about how that worked.
Well, at that time, before the Civil War in Virginia, most schools were subscription schools. Like you said, the parents in the community would pay teachers out of pocket to come in and teach a school. And it was usually 3 or 4 cents per day for each student. And of course, some of those children in the state could not afford that. Some of those families could not afford that. So the state of Virginia had what was called the Literary Fund, and they would designate so much money. And for Wayne County, it was usually a few $100s. They would designate so much money to help fund the tuition for students that were considered poor. So every year, there was a board of school commissioners for each county, and they would do essentially a survey of the county to figure out how many and what students were considered poor and would benefit from that part of the literary fund. Of course, you had the better off students at the top whose parents paid, and then you had the poor students at the bottom who were funded by the state. But there was an entire segment in the middle who were not wealthy enough to pay for it on their own and did not benefit from the literary fund. So you had very small participation in the school system as a result.
What were some of the challenges that you had in writing this book? Because you've got such a detailed history and you've studied this part of the state and this region for so long, what were some of the challenges you faced as you started to put a draft manuscript of this book together? Well,
honestly, this is the first time I've ever had this issue with a book, but there was so much information out there that I really had to narrow down and pick and choose what I wanted to focus on, because there was such a wealth of information available, especially for the one-room schools in the early 1900s up through the 1960s, because there's so many personal histories available. I really had to weed through and determine what I wanted to focus on. And a lot of the stories were similar, because most of these schools were similar in structure. The teaching techniques were very similar. So a lot of the stories were similar, so I had to focus on the more interesting aspects of it, some of the more intriguing details.
Interesting, very good. I know one thing that you talk about too is what happens after the Civil War. Certainly, that is such a huge monumental issue or monumental event in so many ways. Culturally for the country, but also it seems like in this area after the Civil War. Of course, West Virginia was established in 1863, so that was part of what came out of the Civil War. But what was going on? What happened to the schools, and what happened to the school houses themselves, where kids went to school after the Civil War? So we have 20 some years in some cases even longer of education evolving in Wayne County. But what happened to the schools themselves, the facilities, the structures after the Civil War?
Okay. Well, when the war first began, there were only a couple dozen school buildings in the entire county, and of course, like most other infrastructure or organizations in the county, the school system ceased to exist during the war. So the school buildings were confiscated at some point in Cerrito, for example. They were confiscated by soldiers, and most of the buildings were simply abandoned during the war. And after the war, we had a new free school system in West Virginia. So for the first time, all students of school age could attend school in West Virginia for free. That was totally something new for the people in this area. And for the first few years after the war, it was such a change, it was very difficult to get students to actually come to school. It was a huge problem, mainly because in 1865, 1866, there were no school buildings still in use at that time. Whether or not they were still standing, or if they'd been destroyed during the war, or just fell into disrepair, it's hard to know that answer. But the major issue was getting parents to actually send the kids to school for the first time after the war ceased to exist.
Interesting, and I found that so interesting that because we think of kids now being required to go to school, and there's truancy laws to make sure that they go to school, but back then after the war, things being so different. As we fast forward a little bit to the 1890s, one of the things I found that was really interesting is that Cerrito Canova High School became the first public high school in Wayne in the 1890s. What kind of impact did that have on the education of children in this region?
Well, especially in the northern part of the county, near Cerrito and Canova, it made a huge difference, because for most people in the county, you had 1st through 8th grade. That was it. If you were lucky, you got through all 8 grades. And at that time, anyone who achieved a high school education was so much better off educationally than their peers. It was just unbelievable. So essentially, a high school education at that time, a high school diploma, would have been like having a college degree nowadays. And so it certainly benefited the children or the students in the Cerrito Canova area when compared to the rest of the county who didn't have as easy access to that school.
Looking ahead, one thing that I found was very interesting that caught my attention when I was reading your book. You talk about consolidation, and certainly in Wayne County, this has been an issue. This has been an issue in a lot of our counties throughout West Virginia over the last 20 or 25 years. Is that the small community schools are going away? We're seeing the large middle schools, the large high schools, oftentimes with 1,500 to 2,000 students in some cases. And what I found interesting is that this actually started, and you write about this. Back in 1931, we had some consolidation, and you talked about how there were 53 two-room consolidated schools in the county, and there was a school, Fry School on Whites Creek was closed about that time, was converted into a home. The Lavalette community had been served by frame schools. So I think sometimes we look at consolidation as being a new thing or a new trend in the last 20 or 30 years in our schools and our counties, but really Wayne County has been dealing with this issue going back to the early part of the 20th century.
Well, it's, like you said, not a new issue by any means. It's been occurring for over 100 years. The greatest number of schools in Wayne County at one time was in 1910, when we had 179 school buildings in Wayne County. And from that time forward, consolidation has been ongoing. We have fewer schools now than we have since the Civil War. But of course, they're larger. They serve more students than they did at that time. But nonetheless, you still have the trend for over a century of consolidating the small individual schools throughout the county into more centrally located, consolidated buildings, whether it was going from one-room schools down to two-room schools, or in some communities you had multi-room elementary schools being built. by the time you got to the early 1900s. And just like today, families, parents, children, it was a very hot topic at the time. Much like today as well, people felt that community schools catered better to students than the large consolidated schools where you have more kids together. And that was true then and is true today, that people still have the conflicting views on that aspect of consolidation.
So I know you work in the Wayne County school system and are a graduate of there. What kind of impact do you think, having been on both sides recently, been a student and now been a teacher, does the loss of the smaller community schools have? Both as you've studied this from the 1800s on to where we are now, as you mentioned with the schools in Wayne County. What has that done to maybe positively and negatively, what has that done to the teaching and learning of students?
Obviously, I agree with the concept that the small schools provide an identity to the communities that they're in. I mean, Cerrito Canova, that was the heart of that community, was their high school. And I think to some degree, with Cerrito Canova and Crum and Fort Gay, some of that heart or that feeling has been transferred to the middle schools that they have now. And I guess we're lucky where I live in Wayne, we still have our high school that we've had for over 90 years now. And anyone who knows anything about Wayne knows that that's a very, very important part of the community, is not only the education, but the sports teams. And I think it's very important to consider that aspect. But at the same time, with larger schools like Spring Valley, for example, they are able to offer a lot more electives. Sometimes they have better facilities, the more modern schools do. So it is a double-edged sword. So it's, I think just have to really let history kind of determine what the benefits were and the detriments.
Another unique characteristic I really like about your book, as you take us through the history of the school system in the county, is how many people from the 1800s up to present day, or the late 60s or so, and even into today, really are so invested in educating the people of this region, educating the people of that county. And I think no matter what chapter you take us through or what time period, that is a theme that really comes out, is that people were so concerned about making sure that the children over the generations in this area, in the county, had that quality education, which I think it's amazing to think of. We tend to focus on that a lot now and use those buzzwords a lot now, but it was something that you noticed and researched all the way back.
Oh, absolutely. And I think probably more so in the late 1800s, after the Civil War, people had been through one of the most horrific time periods that this area has ever experienced. Untold destruction and death in this community. And they realized that they really needed to provide better opportunities for their children, whether it be better agricultural techniques so that they could make a better living off farming, or if it was learning arithmetic or algebra, try to go on to potentially college education. And they realized that they really needed to start looking at continuing the education beyond a basic reading, writing, and arithmetic basis.
One of the things, too, that I loved about your book when I first looked at it was this picture on the front. And we'll put a picture of the cover up on the screen for our audience to take a look at. But tell us a little bit. We see sort of the rural country road at the top band of the book, and then the title and your name. But this picture at the bottom of these people in front of the schoolhouse. Tell us a little bit. Where is that, and who are those people, and what were they doing in posing for that picture?
That photograph it's thought to be of the Tabor's Fork School on Camp Creek near East Lynn, and it's very typical. It could pass for nearly any one-room school in the county from the 1940s back, honestly. And of course, it was very typical of the style. Small one-room frame building, had a potbelly stove in the center. All the desks were kind of arranged around the stove. And the interesting thing about this photograph is you realize how many students attended these schools. We think about overcrowding at schools as a modern complaint or a modern issue. I talked to a teacher who taught in one-room schools in the late 40s. She's still alive today, and she said she had over 60 kids in one classroom in a one-room school. So that's not something that's a modern issue. It goes back to the very beginning of our school system, overcrowding in some of these early schools.
Yeah. Now we think of 28 or 30 students in a class as being too much. And I'm assuming at this time, maybe not in the case specifically that you're talking about, but in this time in a lot of these one-room schools, you had different ages, different grade levels, different ability levels, and you have 60 of those all in one class. The challenge that would put on the teacher.
Yes. Well, and I think at that time you had I would call it a much closer relationship between the teacher and the parents. The parents lived right within walking distance or within shouting distance of the school itself in many cases. And I saw many accounts where the teacher, if they were having a problem with the student, they would walk out the door and holler for the parent down the road. So it was a very intimate discipline situation where if you were having an issue with the student, the parents were right down the road or within even yelling distance. So I think even though you had these large numbers of students, there were more methods to keep them in line and keep the classroom under control.
You and I were talking a little bit before we started taping today about getting this book out there and the success it's had, and you said that it's gotten a lot of attention, a lot of people really enjoying it. What's your process been like for letting people know that the book is there, and where have you placed the book strategically that you found is been successful in terms of getting people not only interested in it but also to purchase it?
This book it's sold really well since I published it about 3 weeks ago. And like with all my books, I tend to market them mainly in the local area. Excuse me. I do market them on Facebook. I have a Facebook page that I sell the books through. I have an online storefront through the publishing company that I use as well. But honestly, word of mouth is probably the best way that I've done it. I also sell the books at the Wayne Public Library, so people know that they can go there and pick those up. I sell them at Holly's Jewelry Store in Wayne also. But the majority of my books, I couldn't tell you how many times people have come back to me. The same person will come back 3 or 4 times and say, I loaned my book to so-and-so or to my brother or to my sister in California, and then I never got it back, so I want another one. And I'll sell the same book to 3 or 4 people because they do share it with their family or friends or cousins, and they want to come back and get another one because it does interest them and it's important for them to have a copy of their own.
So you mentioned a moment ago that you're working on another book about the Native Americans and their history in the region. How far are you along in that process, and how's the research been on that book?
It's been interesting. It's in the very, very early stages right now. So far, what I've been focusing on is trying to identify as many locations where artifacts have been found as I can. And I've identified several dozen so far, just talking to people that have found arrowheads or stone tools or potential Indian mounds or grave sites throughout the county. So very early in the process, but I think it's going to be an interesting subject to research.
So as a teacher, as someone who works with students every day, has lesson plans to write, papers to grade, etc., how do you find time to balance that and also your research and writing of your books? What's your writing process like?
Well, writing is my hobby. So when I have free time, that's what I do. Instead of doing other activities, that's what I focus on when I do have free time because I enjoy it. And I work on it in the summer quite a bit or over breaks, things like that. I spend probably more time. But really, anytime I have a little bit of an extra moment to spare, I'm researching something or putting together some ideas. So. Free time.
Yeah, I understand that totally. I had a writer one time tell me if you want to be a writer, find a job, and you can't write full time, find a job that allows you to write, and certainly teaching it gives you that opportunity. One thing we also talked about before we started taping today is that you're teaching a special topics class at Wayne High School, all on local history. How's that class been, and what's the students' reaction been to the class?
The students, I think they've enjoyed it so far. It's something that they've never really had access to. Of course, you have West Virginia history in 8th grade in West Virginia, but for the most part, and that's one of the things that spurred me into beginning to research the local area is when I had West Virginia history, there was very little information about the local area. And if I'm learning about West Virginia history, well, we're part of West Virginia, and we're just as important a part as any other county in the state. And that was one of the primary reasons that I wanted to start researching the local community. And so when I was given the opportunity to share some of that information and the stories that I've come across with my students, I jumped at the opportunity. I jumped at that chance. And so far, I think it's gone really well. It's an elective course, so the students that have it really want to be in it. So I'm very pleased with it, and I hope I'm able to continue that for years to come.
So in our final moments with you today, Robert, if anyone wants to get in contact with you to talk to you about Uphill Both Ways, the history of Wayne County schools, how can they get in contact with you if they have questions or comments about the book?
I have an email address. It's robt1687@yahoo.com. Or they can look for my Facebook page online on Facebook. It's Books by Robert M. Thompson. Also have sell my books on lulu.com. That's LULU.com, and they can find them there as well. So.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations to you, Robert Thompson, author of the latest book, Uphill Both Ways, A History of Wayne County Schools, a fascinating book that gives us another great insight into a different aspect of history in this region, and that is the formulation of our educational system from the 1800s on. It's a fantastic book, and anybody who is in education, works in education, has had family members work in education, or wants to learn more about how education developed in Wayne County, I would encourage them to read it because it's a terrific book, and congratulations, and thanks for coming on Chapters today to talk to us about it. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And we want to take a moment to say thanks to Natalie Sheets and the staff at Empire Books and News for being our sponsors of this episode of Chapters, and also providing our studio's taping space today, and also on-site support and assistance for this program. We encourage you to come down to Empire Books and News and talk to Natalie and her staff. For any reading itch that you may have, they can help you satisfy that right here at Empire Books and News. And if you haven't been down to the store for a while, there's been some changes, some very positive changes, both internally and externally with the store structure itself. And we encourage you to come down and check out the all-new revamped Empire Books and News. And we appreciate them sponsoring us each and every episode here on Chapters. And if you're a user of social media, we would love to hear from you from one of the many social media platforms we have available to you and for you to interact with the program. You can send us an email at any time about this Chapters program or any Chapters program that you've seen at the email address that's right here at the bottom of the screen, lp4@zoominternet.net. We do ask that you let us know your name and where you're writing from so that we can keep track of that feedback and comments as they come in. But we appreciate those of you that do email, and please keep those emails coming at lp4@zoominternet.net. Also, we have a Chapters page on YouTube through the Armstrong OneWire link on YouTube, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen. Once you go to the Armstrong OneWire link, click on the Chapters tab, and there we have all of our episodes of author, publisher, and editor interviews archived for you there that you can go back and see for a second or third time. We know many of you have done that. You've left comments in the comments fields, and we appreciate that so much. So if you want to go back and look at some previous episodes all the way back to 2013 when we started the program, they're all archived for you right there on the Armstrong OneWire page on YouTube. And if you're a user on Facebook, we have a Chapters page on Facebook as well. That address is facebook.com/chapters. We have more of our most recent episodes archived there as well, and you can go in and interact and comment with people who watch the program as well. So if you like YouTube, if you like email, if you like Facebook, we've got you covered with ways to reach out and watch previous episodes, current episodes, and interact with the program here on Chapters. So we encourage you to take advantage of that, and we appreciate those of you that have done so. And that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.